This week I want to talk about and show you some of my favourite cookbooks. That's a bit of a departure from my normal recipe and technique videos and sharing things off my menu, but I've got a few of those sorts of videos lined up and I thought I'd do something a little bit different for this one. I've got a passionate interest in cookbooks, and from early in my career I really loved finding great cookbooks, and they were an important part of how I learned about and related to the rest of the food world. And even now, when there's so much more access to online recipes and you can see what people are doing through their social media, there's still something great about sitting down with a physical book and taking the time to look through it. When I started out, this was really the only way to get a sense of what was going on in some of the places that I really admired and couldn't imagine ever getting a chance to visit, so they could really feel like this window through into another world. And one of my proudest moments was when I was finally able to publish my own cookbook, actually with a little bit of help from one of the authors that I'll talk about today. And because I'm talking about cookbooks, I'd be crazy if I didn't at least quickly give my own book a plug. So it's available as a hardback and as a digital copy to download, and I'll have links to both of those in the video description. So today I want to pick a few of my favourite cookbooks that I love, but obviously I can't cover anywhere near as many as I would like, so I've tried to keep it to a sort of rough structure, and then if people enjoy this kind of video, maybe it's something I'll come back to in the future. So I kind of have 4 sections. The first being these beautifully made coffee table books that had a big influence on me. Then some quite practical, useful books that have a lot of really helpful advice contained within them and are really useful for people at any level of experience. Then I've chosen a couple of specific books about fermentation, and I guess I could have picked any area of cooking, but this seemed like a good one to cover for today. And finally, a couple of classic cookbooks that still hold up really well and I found really striking when I first saw them early in my career. So we'll start with that couple of coffee table books that are really visually stunning, and this first book is probably the cookbook that overall had the biggest influence on me. When I was a young chef, I flew myself out to the Madrid Fusion Food Conference because I wanted to go and see people like Ferran Adrià and Jose Andres talk, and I was really interested in what was going on in Spanish food at the time. In fact, I was there the year that Ferran Adrià actually announced the closing of El Bulli, and I also saw chefs like René Redzepi and then Grant Achatz giving a talk. Grant talked a bit about the process of pushing to make this book while he was going through cancer treatment, and I think they showed some images from the book. I remember leaving and being really compelled to go and get it, and then when I saw it, it was just like nothing I'd seen before in food. I'd been following what was going on in restaurants like El Bulli and the Fat Duck, but this was just the thing that really clicked with me. It was so modern and abstract and kind of fundamentally changed how I thought about what food could be. It is an incredible book, and I kind of hope that they'll do another one at some point, because this came out a fair while ago now, and obviously they've done a lot of fantastic new work since then. It'd be great to see some of that in a book too. If you're not familiar with Alinea, then their episode on Chef's Table on Netflix is well worth a watch, and it also kind of leads me on to the next book that I'm going to talk about. So next up, I'm going to show you the Alinea Project book by Alan Hemberger. This isn't really a cookbook per se, but a long time ago I came across Alan because he was writing a blog about the process of cooking his way through the Alinea Cookbook. His photography is obviously incredible, and it was also really interesting to see someone not from a culinary background, but with lots of skills within design and visual arts, working their way through this really complex cookbook. Alan's self-published book takes you through his process of working on that project, but also tells you stories about his life, moving countries, his relationships that happened during that period of time, and it's put together and told in a really beautiful way. So I've mentioned Alan on here before actually, because it was his blog post about the process of making his own chef's knives that inspired me to want to try making my own too. So I have a whole video about that process, and I'll put a link to that in the description. but it's definitely worth having a look at the various things that Alan's done. They're always really interesting, and this book I think is probably my favourite food related book that I own. It's just visually spectacular, really intelligently put together, and really unique. Being self-published, the book was a limited print run, I think, so it might be harder to find a copy now, but if you do come across one, honestly, I really highly recommend it. And this book was so inspiring to me actually that when I was working on self-publishing my own cookbook, I got in touch with Alan to ask him some quite specific advice on a couple of issues, and he was so generous with his time and his feedback, and it was really helpful to me. I think it could actually be a potentially good topic for a future video to talk about the process of how to self-publish your own cookbook, so if that's something that sounds interesting, drop me a comment and let me know. Now, next up might seem like quite a change in style, but equally important and foundational to me at a point where I was learning an awful lot were the River Cottage set of books. This is obviously focused on a more rustic style of food, for want of a better description, but actually I think it's this sort of food, along with the kind of aesthetics and techniques that you might associate with restaurants like Alinea, that make up the kind of fundamental personality of the food that I make. I really quite like working with comforting, old-fashioned flavour combinations and ingredients like rhubarb or gooseberry that could have grown in my nan's yard, and wild ingredients like things like nettles and dandelions, and those are all things that you really get covered well and can explore in the River Cottage books. I've got a few of these, and when I first made sourdough I learned that process from the River Cottage book. I really like the hedgerow book, which is kind of focused on foraging and then various different things that you can do with things that you might be able to find. Each of the books gives you a really good introduction to the topic that it's on, and they're written by people that are experts, but in a way that's accessible and useful. You could be at any level, I think, from being quite new to cooking to being a professional, and find stuff within all of these books that you'd find interesting and helpful. And something else that's going to be a bit of a theme for the next couple of books I talk about too is that they're full of food that just really looks like stuff that you want to make. The ideas are all really good, the flavour combinations are all really delicious. They're really great books to just pick up and dip into, and I love having them around. There's a certain amount of foraging covered in the River Cottage books, but if that's something you're particularly interested in and you wanted to go deeper into it, then another book that I'd really recommend is the Forager's Handbook by Miles Irving. That's another book that I've mentioned already on here, and it's a fantastic resource. Miles is an absolute expert in his field, and this is something I'd definitely recommend if you want to get more into wild food. Also leading on from the River Cottage books are Gill Mellow's books, and he worked at the River Cottage and on a couple of the cookbooks, so there's quite a lot of overlap in terms of style, but I particularly love his cookbooks as just something to go to where you'll find loads of stuff that, again, you really want to make and really want to eat. His books are structured by ingredients and seasons rather than by topics, and almost anywhere you open the book, you're going to see something that just immediately makes you want to make it. It's not a particularly chefy book. I think it's great for home cooks and professionals alike, and it's also made beautifully. The photography in this is fantastic. It's really nicely designed and a real joy to look through. Next up, I thought it'd be good to look at a couple of books specifically on fermentation. And again, because they kind of cover everything, there is a River Cottage book on fermentation, which is really great too. But there's a couple more that I wanted to talk about. So if you found that you've gone through something like the River Cottage fermentation book and you've enjoyed that, and it's a topic that you're interested in, but you're maybe wanting to get a little bit more in depth, or maybe go on to some slightly more advanced techniques and things like making misos or even soy sauce, then I'd highly recommend the Noma Guide to Fermentation. There's lots of great books on this topic out there, but this is just fantastically well structured, I think. The way that everything is broken down is really useful, it's very user-friendly, and again, this is something that I think is great for everyone from home cooks right through to really serious food professionals. Everything in here is really clear, and it's nice as well the way that it's broken down into fundamental techniques that often build onto each other, and then it goes a little bit further to sort of show you how you can start to creatively apply those or make your own recipes if that's the direction that you want to go in. That Noma book is a great practical guide, and I definitely recommend it if you're thinking about getting into sort of more serious fermentation. And then alongside that, if you are thinking a bit more seriously about it, then Sandor Katz's The Art of Fermentation is an absolute classic and a really great read if it's a topic that you're into. Then the other book I'll give a mention to here is Koji Alchemy. And if you know a little bit about Koji and stuff, then you're probably already aware of this book anyway, but it's really great for some interesting deeper dives into different methods and utilizations of Koji in fermentation. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention in this video is two books that I'd put into the category of being sort of modern classics. The first of those being the French Laundry Cookbook. I think lots of people would consider this to be a great modern classic cookbook. It's so clean and refined in its presentation. It's got a real classy, classical feeling with lots of beautiful food images and recipes inside. It's got a real timelessness to it. This was one of the sort of first serious restaurant cookbooks in my collection, and definitely something that had a big impact on me when I first saw it. It's another example of one of these books that gave me a window into this world and this restaurant that looked really exciting and different and was somewhere I could never really expect to visit, so it was fascinating to be able to have just a little bit of an insight into what they were doing there. And around the same time that I got the French Laundry Cookbook, I also got this cookbook, Essence. In a lot of ways it has quite a similar feel, I think, and what I loved about this book is the mixture between quite classical technique and very refined work, and then it was one of the first places, sort of before it was popularised by the new Nordic cuisine movement, where I saw a lot of foraged ingredients being used and sort of alongside this fairly classical work. It's a really beautiful book, I think, and one that if you haven't come across it before, I would definitely recommend. So I think that's probably about it for this video. I'm about to lose the light, but I just wanted to try making something a little bit different and do a short video on a subject that I'm really interested in. I think cookbooks are really beautiful and they had such a big influence on how I developed as a chef. If you've got a particular favourite, I'd love to hear what it is down in the comments, and if people like this sort of video, then maybe I'll think about doing another one at some point and featuring some of the other books that I haven't had a chance to mention here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.